Well, good morning. It's great to be here with you at the Ligonier Pre-Conference. I'm looking forward to the conference to follow. And this is a worthy topic and subject for our conversation and consideration today. We think about new media. It still is new. The problem is there is new coming behind the new all the time. And so even as we are in conversation, there are new forms of media that are being born around us. And each one of these will require some pretty careful Christian consideration when we put that against the backdrop of our stewardship and our witness and our concern to communicate the gospel of Jesus Christ. We are relational creatures. It's important that we realize that this is not some kind of accident, but that a part of what it means to be in the image of God is that we have the ability to communicate, we have the urge to communicate, we have the tools of communication, and we have this very important aspect of our lives that is purely, irreducibly relational. What makes so much of the new media new is its ability to emulate and perhaps to extend relationships. By emulate, many of the forms of new media have the appearance or the feel or the pretense of being relational. And sometimes these new media actually accomplish something that is genuinely relational. People on Facebook are discovering friends from whom they had been disconnected for decades. People are in conversation with relatives and friends and persons in expanding circles of relationship. But at the same time, even as more and more time and attentiveness is being directed to so many of these forms of new media, what seems to be suffering is the conversation with a person with you at the breakfast table or in the bedroom down the hall. Every once in a while in the old media, we gain an interesting perspective on the new media. Last Monday, June 7, 2010, USA Today, headline life section, the iPad bringing people together. Just hold that when you consider that the New York Times devoted almost 3 full pages to a consideration that began on the first page, the front page, hooked on gadgets and paying a mental price. I wrote about this particular article and the study behind it at my website this morning in order to draw attention to the very issues about which I'm going to be speaking. Because this particular article tells about the Campbell family of California. The father is so invested in the digital devices that he is virtually unable to have a conversation with his own wife and children. Rather than pulling back from that, the rest of the family is being pulled into that vortex, and the 8-year-old daughter and the 16-year-old son and Mr. Campbell's wife is being drawn now each into his and her own digital world. And that's a picture of what can happen. This is a hyper-social generation. It's very interesting. We use that word, and like the word relationship, it implies something that may or may not be there. It's a hyper-socialized generation, especially as you look to the generation of young people. When you go younger in the culture and you look at the use of social media, you discover that the socialization that in past used to take place in pre-adolescent and adolescent life in terms of conversation and actual face-to-face communication and those old things we used to call words, these are being replaced by something else. Very interesting anecdote. Every once in a while, the anecdotes reveal who we are. Jeffrey Zaslow, the Wall Street Journal, writes about a 17-year-old boy sent to the vice principal's office after having been caught sending text messages in class. The vice principal, Steve Gallagher, told the boy to pay attention to the teacher, not to his cell phone. Even as the boy nodded politely, Gallagher noticed something amiss. The boy was texting about his discipline for being caught texting. Gallagher said it was a subconscious act. Young people today are connected socially from the moment they open their eyes in the morning until they close their eyes at night. It's compulsive. Zaslow termed this hyper-socializing. He said this, because so many people in their teens and early 20s are in this constant whir of socializing, accessible to each other every minute of the day via cell phone, instant messaging, and social networking websites, there are a host of new questions that need to be addressed in schools, in the workplace, and at home. Chief among them, how much work can hyper-socializing students or employees really accomplish if they are holding multiple conversations with friends via text messaging or are obsessively checking Facebook? Now, we need to actually get some metrics in order to gain some understanding of what's going on here. The Kaiser Family Foundation released a study, the second of these studies. The first was done 5 years ago. Now, get this, 5 years ago, the Kaiser Family Foundation, pouring millions of dollars into this study, discovered that American adolescents and young adults are spending about 6.5 hours a day with media. Those are 6.5 clock hours of media. 5 years later, a study just completed, they decided they would go back and revisit the question. The researchers had a basic assumption, and that is there are no more hours in the day, and given what children do, just in terms of school and other responsibilities and that thing some people call sleep, it was assumed that there could be no more time devoted to technology, electronic media, and all the rest. It turned out that a full hour had been added in a 5-year period, from 6.5 hours a day to 7.5 hours a day. But get this, the study also found out that these young people are cramming 11 plus hours of media into 7.5 hours a day. Now, some of you out there know immediately how this can be done. That is, those of you who are somewhat familiar with the new media about which we're talking. Some of you out there are right now puzzled as to how someone can put over 11 hours of technological exposure into 7.5 hours of the day. It's called multitasking. And if you want to know what that looks like, just picture a 17-year-old with the earphones in his ear listening to the iPod, with the text happening with his thumbs on his cell phone, with his iPad or laptop animated before him, waiting for what's going to come. They are adding up cumulative exposure to all these media. It's called hyper-socializing. It's called multitasking. It's called a new form of insanity. What we're looking at here are metrics that are literally hard to believe. For instance, just in text messaging. The Pew Research Center released statistics just recently, and this is April the 20th of this year, on text messaging among American teenagers. Now get this, 1 in 3 American teenagers sends more than 100 text messages a day. That is approximately, for those of you who still hold to the old math, over 3,000 texts a month. Fully 2/3 of teens say they are more likely to use their cell phones to text their friends than to talk to them by the cell phone. Daily text messaging from teens to teens has increased so much since the year 2008 that only 38% of teens back in 2008 were daily texters. Now that has arisen to 54% in 2008, 75% of those who own cell phones, 87% at least occasionally. Half of all teens send 50 or more text messages a day, or 1,500 texts a month. 1 in 3, again, more than 3,000. 15% of teens who are texters send more than 200 texts a day, or more than 6,000 texts a month. Now, this is going to be shocking to all of you. Boys typically send and receive 30 texts a day. Girls typically send and receive 80 messages per day. You're talking about, by the way, a technology here that's been an enormous boon for the cellular industry, because the amount of bandwidth that is consumed by a text message is minuscule, and they're able to charge for these, and thus the shift from cellular conversation to text messaging has been a financial boon. And teenagers have reached the point now where study after study is indicating that they text rather than talk, not only when it comes to their parents, but to each other. There are teenagers who have cell phones who don't even use them for any kind of voice communication. It's simply a platform for their texting. Increasingly, and this is one of the most frightening things I've seen lately, increasingly parents and their own children are replacing face-to-face, voice-to-voice conversation with text messaging. The migration of the conversation between parent and child from voice-to-voice conversation to the cell phone has been eclipsed by the transition from the cell phone as a voice technology to the cell phone as merely a text technology. There are families communicating with each other by text messaging when they are in the same house. So while we're talking about hyper-socializing, we need to recognize that this does not mean any necessary gain in human relationships. As a matter of fact, it may imply and actually represent a very significant cost. If a teenager is sending 6,000 text messages per month, it is likely, it is absolutely necessary that something else is not being done. Some other form of communication is not happening if that is happening. Teenagers have now become so compulsive about this that they will sleep with their cell phones, if allowed, on the pillow so that they will not miss an urgent and important text message. Teenagers have become so compulsive about this that adolescents and young adults are so connected to the electronic devices that in their waking hours, they are virtually never apart from them. And that's why adults like to talk about teenagers and young adults in their use of these technologies. Because the reality is, what they are doing is just a picture, sometimes in extreme and sometimes no more extreme, of what their parents are doing. Because the reality is that this hyper-socializing is now becoming so interwoven into the culture, into our lives, into our families, into our relationships, that you've got parents with their laptops and iPads falling asleep with the machine on the chest, and the teenagers down the hall, the young adults in their cocoons with the cell phone on the pillow. Now, what is the cost of all of this? That's what's really interesting. The statistics and the metrics pile up, and it would frankly be useful for us to consider all that these different measurements and metrics might imply. But we've probably said enough to understand that what we have is a new reality in human experience. What we have is a new reality for young adults and for teenagers in a very acute and indeed alarming way, and increasingly for their parents as well. What happens to us? What happens to our souls? What happens to our relationships when there is this migration of time and attention and devotion and relatedness from conversations and relationships, face-to-face, voice-to-voice with human beings, to changing that to being a conversation or relationship mediated by machine? The other thing we need to note is that even as we cited the metric that boys and girls are inversely related when it comes to the number of text messages sent and received, young males and young females also have different ways of relating to the machines. Young females tend to look at the machines in terms of relatedness, in terms of this hyper-socialization, in terms of being afraid to be out of touch with anyone, of missing some word that is being sent virally through the system in terms of peers and acquaintances. Boys increasingly have the machines as a way of escape. The machine with its games, with its electronic entertainment, becomes a private cocoon, a private world. And that is not true just for adolescent males, but for many adults as well. Cord Campbell, profiled in this New York Times piece, is so unable now to focus on family reality, even to enjoy a family event, that he will exit that kind of event. If there's the slightest strain, if there's the slightest tension in terms of something going on in the house, he just disappears into his iPad or his laptop, playing a video game or doing something, checking email, checking websites. When we talk about hyper-socializing, we need to be honest and recognize that on the one hand, we really are talking about a hyper-socializing phenomenon. We really are talking about young people, and now older people, following the example of the young, shifting so much of our relatedness and so much of our social engagement into these electronic formats, digital technologies. On the other hand, there is the temptation represented by these technologies to actually withdraw, to go into the self to an even greater degree, to define your own private world intellectually, ideologically, in terms of entertainment. And given the propensity of human beings, on the one hand, to over-relate and draw our self-worth and our sense of self from that relatedness, or at the other extreme, to withdraw from relatedness and go entirely within, these digital technologies have allowed both directions to happen simultaneously. This is a quantum shift in human experience. Those who follow and try to track historically shifts in human experience and in information are undoubtedly, in terms of their own consensus now, looking at this shift that has taken place over the last 10 years as the most fundamental shift in terms of human relatedness since two developments: the development of written language and the development of the printing press. What we are looking at here is almost surely going to have greater long-term social and personal effects than the arrival of broadcast media, of radio and television. When the internet was born and the personal computer became a part of our lives, almost no one envisioned what was coming in terms of the networking, the relatedness. When Facebook was birthed and the idea of a 19-year-old sophomore at Harvard who developed the idea on a whiteboard in a dorm room, no one was looking forward to a future when over 400 million people around the world would be related to each other by Facebook. 75% of those millions outside the United States. No one saw this coming. No one has been able to take full account and consideration of what these things mean. Let me suggest to you several things we ought to keep in mind. As we are Christians, we need to understand, number one, that the digital revolution is here to stay. This is not some temporary stage. We're not all of a sudden going to wake up one morning and say, you know, we really don't need these things. We're going to let it all go. They are now so interwoven in our lives that our communication, our commerce, our education, and increasingly the way we actually just make this society work is now dependent, reliant upon these new digital technologies and upon the relatedness. When you talk to a teenager, an adolescent who's now in trouble by parents who all of a sudden decide there needs to be some accounting and responsibility for this, and they get a cell phone bill or something comes to their attention, they realize there's a problem, and they talk to their own teenager, and especially if the teenager happens to be female, but increasingly also if it's male. And they're talking to this young person, and they say, you really do not need this all the time. That child looks at the parent as if the parent has just said, you don't need to breathe. Because in their world, not being connected is worse than dead. It implies you don't care. It implies you're no longer a part of the group. It implies that you really are exiting life. But then again, if the parents talk to each other, they need to recognize that we increasingly live in a time in which these digital devices and technologies come with imperatives into our lives as well. We have clients and friends and church members and relatives and donors and friends who expect that we will almost instantly receive and pay attention to their emails, their text messages, their digital communications. We understand the imperative. Anyone who's in business, anyone who's in any kind of social engagement, anyone who's trying to communicate, anyone who's operating within this culture understands that it is increasingly almost impossible to withdraw without implying more than we mean to imply. So the digital revolution is here to stay, and the reason it is here to stay is not because of individual decisions made by users of digital technology, but because of the direction of the economy, of the educational system, of the culture at large. If you want to buy many things, the only way you're actually able to buy them, to purchase them, is to go online. Just try calling an airline to buy an airline ticket. If you need help with something, just try picking up a phone and calling. Call centers are experiments now in absolute frustration, because as the people who run them will tell you, the only people who call are the people who can't follow the instructions to go online in the first place. To be human and to be engaged in the 21st century is to be, to some degree, digital. And what's really interesting here, this is a little footnote, this is free. What's really interesting is how many people think they are not connected to this. Every once in a while I'll meet someone who says, I don't read email, I don't have anything to do with computers, I don't have a laptop, I don't have this, I don't have this, I don't have this, I don't do any of that. Fold the arms and smile. Well, he's got somebody else doing it. Somebody is printing out his emails and bringing them to him so that he can act like a medieval scribe. Light the candle on his desk and write what he wants to respond. Someone else is his human digital assistant, because that's just the way it is. The digital revolution is here to stay. We're not going to pull this back. As a matter of fact, we had better expect that given the money, given the social and cultural imperatives in the new economy, you can expect that this hyper-socialization is going to become more and more hyper as we redefine just how much of this technology we can bring into our lives. The second thing, very quickly, that is very important is that parents must take control. Now, as I was asked to speak to this issue, clearly a central concern here should be directed toward the young, where parents have been forfeiting responsibility. The Kaiser Family Foundation study discovered that most parents set absolutely no rules for the use of digital technology on the part of their own children and adolescents. None. The parents who do set rules tend to set rules on content rather than on the length and depth of exposure. Now, that content boundary is very important, but quite frankly, there are parents who, for instance, concerned with pornography and other things on the net, carefully put filters and other kinds of mechanisms, which are at least good faith attempts to limit that, on the computers without realizing that a cell phone that is connected to the internet has access to virtually everything and more that that computer has. Parents, when they do set guidelines, actually can have a pretty massive impact in the lives of their adolescents. I talk about this quite frequently, and there's some simple common sense things that just ought to make sense. Adolescents ought not to have cell phones in their bedrooms at night. If they need help, they still have a voice. They can call out. If there's an emergency and they need to use a cell phone to call mom and dad down the hall, we've already got a problem. The cell phone in the bedroom at night is an invitation not to sleep, not to study, and not to do many other things about which we will shortly speak. The same thing is true, of course, about the computer. Any parent who allows adolescents and children to have internet-connected computers in the bedroom is actually inviting all kinds of problems into the home, into the life, into the souls of their own children. At the same time, as we're talking about what parents must do in order to take control, we as parents have to model this as well. It would just be a new form of parental hypocrisy if we actually make these demands of our children while flaunting these same principles and concerns when it comes to our own lives. There have to be boundaries that are established. We also need to recognize, and we're talking about the digital generation, we need to understand that there are some particular challenges that are going to come to this generation. They may be hyper-socialized, but they are undernourished, and there are two particular issues that are missing from their lives. There are two realities that have been important to Christians for reasons that we can understand and are important, no doubt, to those of us who are in this room, that are missing, almost entirely missing from the lives of American adolescents and young adults. And the first of these is silence. It is almost impossible to find oneself in silence in this culture unless one is determined so to do. We are surrounded by all these opportunities for noise and communication and entertainment and information. And yet the human soul requires a certain amount of silence. Our understanding of prayer, our understanding of what it means to try to direct the mind toward our Creator, our Redeemer, it requires some silence. And yet that is the one commodity that is not only missing from the lives of so many people that are a part of our culture today. The more young, the more pressing. But it is no longer even something that comes to us naturally. Silence, as one 15-year-old boy said, is scary. You know why it's scary? It's because in silence, we hear ourselves, even as we seek to hear from God. Secondly, what is missing from their lives is reading. The one form of information technology that has fallen behind in the lives of American young people is reading. Now, you may say, well, they're reading online. Well, if you think that reading a few snippets online is the equivalent of the experience of sitting with a book and reading a book, I mean the old way, sequentially, cover to cover, well, your response tells me you do know that there's a difference. Christians have been, first of all, people of the book. We understand that the speaking God has spoken to us in His written word, the inerrant, infallible Word of God. We come to understand the power of the Word of God in the life of a believer as the Holy Spirit accompanies the Word, doing a work within us as the Bible reads us, as we read the Bible, as God speaks to us. There is something quite different happening in the lives and not happening in the lives of a generation that increasingly finds reading an alien activity and finds silence an absent commodity. And when you put together the absence of reading and silence, you have a soul that is filled with distraction. And often a soul that is nourished by distraction and afraid of not being distracted. We have a generation that is beginning to think that we have developed a new form, a new mode of knowing called multitasking. And we like to think, and this is not just a conceit of the young, these realities arrive first among the young because they are the most hyper-socialized and hyper-technologized, but they eventually work upwards in the society to adults, even now older adults as well. But one of the realities we have to face when we look at this is that what is missing from their lives is what is absolutely necessary for the nourishment of the soul. It is possible to fill our lives with so much noise and so much chatter and so much entertainment and so much information and call it multitasking. That we can try to allow ourselves the conceit that we're still connected. We're still devoted. The average worker in an office with a computer changes frames 37 times an hour. The average person who is connected to digital technology is carrying not one, not two, but 3 digital devices over the course of a week. We claim that we can listen to this and play with that and read this and follow this all at the same time. And we fool ourselves. The most massive study on multitasking has discovered that it's a myth. We really do not have brains that God gave us and made for us to multitask. It turns out that multitasking robs us of attentiveness, robs us of memory, robs us of empathy. Many modern human beings, young and old, are losing the ability to read facial expressions. Children are showing up in kindergarten and primary school classes, and teachers are beginning to note they lack the ability to read facial expressions because their relatedness has been to cathode ray tubes and gas plasma screens and those little tiny screens on digital devices. We need to recognize there's an enormous cost in this. We need to understand that a part of this, fourth, is a cost to relationships between parent and child. A recent article on when to buy a cell phone for your child pointed out that many people are becoming concerned that the moment you hand a cell phone to a child, there's an immediate shift in the parent-child relationship. And that immediate shift takes place because once that child is connected to peers, those peer relationships and peer communications begin to intrude, and there is a marked decrease in parent-child interaction in terms of voice communication the moment a cell phone enters the picture. And then you realize there are many parents who are saying, but I'm connected with my child by the cell phone. Yes, and that's the helicopter parent that every college president can tell you about. We've raised now a generation of college students who text mom to ask which flavor of energy drink to buy in the cafeteria. These digital devices have also tethered our children to ourselves in such a way that they are not growing up into maturity, even in making decisions. Fifth, this is an enormous challenge to the church. It's a challenge to parents, yes, but it's a challenge to the church because the church of the Lord Jesus Christ is to be the faithful body of Christ, engaged with each other, related to each other, and seeking to relate to the world in order to share the gospel. Now, do these technologies bring new ways to share and communicate the gospel? Of course. But there is no replacement for the sharing of the gospel that takes place face-to-face and voice-to-voice. And we fool ourselves if we believe that we can shift all of our attentiveness to digital technologies without tremendous loss, theologically, spiritually, biblically, ecclesiologically, personally. Sixth, as we think about the hyper-socialized generation, we need to recognize that it is, first of all, a challenge for ourselves before it's a challenge we would address to others. It is very important that Christian leaders, pastors, teachers, parents, those of us with responsibility, figure out prayerfully, devotedly, together in conversation and mutual accountability to the Lordship of Christ, how it is that we will make use of these technologies. We'll have to answer some hard questions. Are there technologies and technological platforms and means of social communication that are wrong? How do we establish the right kind of boundaries? I was just talking to a pastor the other day. He and his church staff have an agreement and with the elders of the church when it comes to Facebook that they will not allow themselves to friend anyone they kissed in high school or college. It's an interesting rule. I just imagine trying to sit down with Charles Spurgeon and have a conversation. Yeah, the policies you have at the Metropolitan Tabernacle, do you friend people you kissed as adolescents? Imagine talking about that with, well, frankly, just about anyone before the Facebook revolution. But you recognize that that's an immediate sense in which the risk of a relationship outweighs the potential benefit of a relationship, and the technology allows the misuse and corruption of such relationships. It's a challenge to the church as we try to determine together how to be connected and faithful. One of the greatest challenges to come to the Christian church in our generation is going to be not only for the young, but for ourselves and for those who come, how may we be both connected and faithful? May God give us guidance. God bless you.